What does creativity mean to you?
Creativity comes from a foundation of curiosity.
It's about being able to think outside the box. It's being able to, challenge the status quo.
You're stuck in the box of what occurs today.
It's a constant journey.
But you have to be ready to invest in it.
There is no one in the world who cannot be creative.
Welcome, everybody, to this next episode of Talking Creativity, our podcast surrounding the topic of creativity. Today, we have a special guest who brings a unique blend of creativity and science to our podcast. He's a brilliant neuroscience researcher, the great-grandchild of the inventor of the root beer float. What's that? Super interesting. We're curious to learn about that. And a true family person. Please welcome to the podcast, Adam Green. Adam is not just any neuroscientist. He's the director of Georgetown Laboratory for Relational Cognition and Provost's Distinguished Associate Professor at Georgetown University. He's also the founder and former president of the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity. Talk about a brainy bunch. But wait, there's more. Adam's research dives deep into the neuromechanisms that spark our best ideas, exploring everything from endogenous brain processes to exogenous neurostimulation. Imagine having a thinking cap that actually works. Adam's work is making that a reality, hopefully soon. And if that wasn't impressive enough, he's also the incoming editor-in-chief at the Creativity Research Journal. So whether he's unraveling the mysteries of the mind or editing groundbreaking research, Adam is always at the forefront of creativity and cognition. Welcome, Adam. It's a real pleasure to have you today.
Oh, thank you, Toby. So good to be here.
Most important question, and we already had a chat before meeting you, Adam, Martin and me. Tell us about the root beer floats.
So that's a fascinating topic. I will try not to spend our full time talking about root beer floats. So for years, this was really a part of my personal journey. So maybe it's relevant. For years, I found myself trying to perfect the combination of ice cream and root beer. Now, are you familiar with root beer? Because my understanding is that there's not a lot of root beer in Europe. So you guys know root beer, and is it made with the sassafras root? This is how it's made.
Mm-hmm.
There's two different, or some people would argue more than two, but a couple of different plants, trees that you can use the root. Mm-hmm. You make the beer. And my wife would laugh at me, but every time we would have friends over, I would have a new sort of combination of the best sort of artisanal root beer, the best, local organic ice cream, and these, different flavor combinations. I would bring these into my class. If I had a seminar on the last day, you can't give in the US, you can't give 18-year-olds alcohol. So we would all toast with root beer floats. This went on for years. 4 years ago, we went to the town of Cripple Creek, Colorado, where I knew that I had some ancestry that, some of my family, when they first came to the U.S. from Europe, had settled there. It was a silver mining town a very long time ago. But they had owned a general store. And my grandmother would tell stories about sleeping in the apartment above the general store where her grandparents lived. And in the middle of the night, the corks from the bottles of root beer, from the barrels of root beer would fly up and, hit the bottom of the floorboards and wake her up. And so I knew that they had made root beer. But what I didn't know, and what we found out when we went to Cripple Creek, Colorado, we found it's now sort of a preserved Old West town, like where you would see a gunfight in an Old West American movie. They've tried to preserve it. The storefront of the general store says, it has my grandmother's family name. This wasn't just a myth. They were there. And in the corner of the window is a plaque that says that on this site, the root beer float was invented, and they called it the Black Cow for some reason. I guess it's because it's sort of black and white, looks like a cow. Yeah, but that to me, because I'd always had this sort of draw toward root beer floats. It was just a fascinating thing that this had been in my family through the generations.
What a coincidence.
It really was. It sort of validated my identity in a really sort of deep and fundamental way.
Yeah, and not only the root beer, but also the topic of creativity, right? So if he was the inventor of the root beer float,
now everything makes sense.
Yeah,
innovation, and combinatorial innovation. So you take these different things and you put them together, which is a lot of what my research has been about, especially with relational reasoning, creative relational reasoning.
Shall we dive deeper into the research that you are doing and the research of creativity? So is there something that you can tell us probably of the research about the neuroscience of creativity? Is there something that you can tell us, probably in more easier words than the usual research terms that people use, so that everyone can understand that? What's about the neuroscience of creativity?
Sure. Well, if you don't want to talk about root beer floats the whole time, I suppose we can talk about creativity.
We come back to that.
We'll come back to it. It's at the center of everything.
Taste it.
Yeah.
So
if only teams had that feature in this call, we could taste it. So the neuroscience of creativity. As Toby mentioned, I sort of have a front row seat in many ways to a lot of what's happening in the field, because I've been fortunate to be involved with the development and leadership of the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity, which has now become a large global organization, and it has sort of wonderful, a wonderfully broad and wonderfully accomplished sort of membership that's doing lots of the very interesting things, and also being able to edit one of the journals in the field, Creativity Research Journal. You see a lot of the new things that are coming through, and I think that what strikes me about the field is that there's a lot of heterogeneity, and I think within certain parameters, I think that's very healthy. I think that it's important to recognize that creativity isn't just one thing. And so it's important that creativity researchers are not researching just one thing. Some of the work that we were just starting to lead into with the root beer float discussion, some of the work around relational integration, relational cognition, I think points to mechanisms that integrate information within the brain. So mechanisms like frontopolar cortex at the very far front of the brain, which is highly interconnected with other regions of the brain that store and represent semantic information, and helps to bring those different pieces of information together when you want to generate something new and build it of these separate pieces. I think that's one part of the story. I think there's so much more to the story. One of the very robust lines of work in the neuroscience of creativity is research around the connection between frontal areas and areas of the default mode within the brain, more in the middle of the brain, more toward the center of the brain as opposed to the front of the brain, with the general idea being that what's happening toward the middle of the brain in the default mode is at least in some way related to a broad search for many, many possible ideas in a sort of unconstrained or less constrained way, whereas the front of the brain introduces some very useful constraint, because not every possible idea is a good idea, right? It might, there's a lot that's just weird, but isn't particularly a good idea. And so that interplay between the frontal and default mode or other regions that are involved with idea generation, that seems to be a big part of the story. And seeing with the imaging technologies that we have, such as fMRI, and obviously Siemens is always a part of that story, that these two different things, so the frontopolar activity increasing as people's creativity increases, and showing that the more their frontopolar activity is increasing, the better they're doing at improving their own creativity, translating that to actually stimulating the brain directly. going from observation to intervention and saying, okay, now that we've learned how this mechanism works, we can actually help brains do this better and see that this actually does improve creative thinking. Likewise, with this story about frontal and default mode networks being connected, showing that even though in most cases they actually don't want anything to do with each other and they're anti-correlated, when you start thinking creatively, you start to see at least some parts of that prefrontal network become more connected, more functionally connected, more in communication with the default mode areas. This and then actually now trying to translate that from observation to intervention, which is something that my work and some other labs as well are currently very interested in doing. Those are two of the stories in the neuroscience of creativity. And again, I think this story about moving from observation to intervention is a big theme in what's happening now in the neuroscience of creativity. But there's many more, narratives. There are narratives related to, for example, temporal lobe activity as a marker of creative insight, of seeing a connection or understanding how different things might lead to a creative solution. Especially in the context of problem solving. Some new work that I'm very excited about and that my lab is now also working to sort of introduce into intervention type contexts is around spectral power volatility. How much are the oscillations in your brain going crazy versus staying at sort of a steady place? With the, you might think crazier is better for creativity, but that's actually not true. That's a myth. The sort of longstanding myth tying, crazy to creativity, I think it gives us some color, but mostly it leads us astray. In fact, what we see with the spectral power volatility work is that lower volatility is better for actually coming up with better ideas. So these are just some of the stories. There are many others. And the point is that creativity is a big umbrella term for lots of different things that the brain does. And so as long as we are careful about our constructs, we're not just, sort of making things up as we go. We do have to be careful about the meaningfulness of the constructs. I think the heterogeneity, engaging these different mechanisms, these different stories in the brain about what creativity is and how it happens, I think they're all valuable.
Yeah, talking about myths. Yesterday I had a workshop with a team of people from Siemens, and the typical question is always, hey, is it really like that? Left brain, right brain, logic, and creative brain? What's your take on that? And why do you think this myth started to evolve? And is it still valid? No, I don't think so. Can you say something about that?
No, yeah. I think I think that myth, if nothing else, it evolved the way that most myths do, which is that it's easy to remember, and it's a very simple explanation, and then you can sort of move on and not think too much about it. I think that's why we have myths. They help us. Sometimes we need that, right? But I think if you actually want to find out what's really going on, you have to obviously be willing to engage the nuance, engage the complexity more than that. Left and right brain really, you can look at the way that the brain processes perceptual information in terms of more holistic processing versus more detailed or sort of smaller bits of information. And you can generally see some processing differences from the left to the right side. And so I think a lot of that led to the idea that, okay, this more sort of abstract, broader kind of way of processing, whether it's visual or auditory information, maybe this is more, creative because it's broader. I think that's all very thin. Like when we actually look at creativity in the brain, it's not the province of one hemisphere or the other. And in fact, a lot of this work that I mentioned related to both the integration of different pieces of information to generate analogies or new ideas, and this story about the relationship of the prefrontal cortex to the default mode. Both of those stories heavily involve left-sided prefrontal cortex. So I think we wouldn't necessarily want to say that once that somehow the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere is more creative. It's really, and I think that there's a lesson in it too, because I think the notion, even if it was right, which it isn't, but even if it was right, it comes from the idea that creativity is all about being sort of not detailed, being not constrained at all, right? And that is, I mean, I wouldn't tell anyone that they shouldn't, that their notion of creativity, has no merit. But I think if what we want out of creativity is good ideas, then I think creativity has to be more than just that, more than just weird.
Yeah, I think that's a complex thing about creativity, that it's not just the one thing that you need to do probably, but there's different things that go into different directions. Yeah, and you cannot tell when to do this and when to do that, but it's complicated and complex.
It's about a balance in some way. Yeah. Like if we talk about divergence and convergence, just as a not very neuroscience driven thing, it's also balance here. And I think also if it comes to the brain, might also be about balance of both things, right? Broad and very specific. Interesting. Yes. Also, before we dive deeper into everything you already mentioned, and also this intervention perspective, which is, in my point of view, very, very interesting. What inspired you to actually pursue this path into neuroscience of creativity? Was there really the connection to the root beer float, or I don't know, what made you work?
Oh, that would make a wonderful story. I should tell it that way. But there's some saying that's a story so good it should be true. But no, I mean, I think, it's one of those things when people ask me that question where it just seems like what drew you to, enjoying, some sugar, right? Like it's sort of like, well, isn't it obvious? To me, it's always been so fascinating that it didn't need a justification, right? And as soon as I was aware that it was a thing, it was interesting to me. But I think maybe part of that story is being very interested in the philosophy of mind as a kid, reading books that my dad had on the shelf and these sorts of things, and then starting to think, well, what okay, so these fascinating things that we call mind, these are somehow built out of physical stuff, right? And so in and of itself, any part of that would be fascinating. But then let's just take it to the extreme. What's the most interesting thing that the brain does? The thing that seems most to defy this explanation of physicality. And in my mind, creativity is the height of the mind's reach, right? And it's, so to be able, if we can start to explain that in physical terms, then I think that's really summiting the mountain. And I think because not only of the capacity to explain it, but because that capacity to explain it may lead to the capacity to enhance it. And that is, the transition then between observation and intervention. And if we can help brains think more creatively, I think we can do good in the world. We can give people that experience of thinking more creatively, but the ideas that are generated can also, have benefit beyond just the individual experience of creativity. But you have to understand a thing at least a little bit in order to improve it, to construct a way to boost it.
Yeah. Talking about these interventions things, you did a lot of research on the brain and also the cap thing, the brain cap that Toby already mentioned in the beginning. What is it that does this cap does? How does it help the brain to think more creatively? And of course, if we look into the future, might this be applicable also to business, that people in the meeting rooms, wherever they are, use these kind of caps really and to be more creative? Is that the way you look at the future, or is that some different way?
No, well, it's not different from how I think of the future, although it's not just one cap. I think it's not. There are many different modes that we can use, many different tools that we can use to stimulate brain function, right? And so that paper with the silly title, "Thinking Cap plus Thinking Zep," that's a paper that we published. It was really exciting because it was showing, look, you can take what we've learned about at least one creative mechanism in the brain, the when it happens, the how it happens, the where it happens, apply all of that to target brain stimulation that should be able at that time and in that way, and at that place in the brain, to actually enhance this, right? So this was using a technology called transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS. But there are many others. So TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, may actually be more familiar to people because it's used in a lot of different contexts. It's used as an anti-depression treatment, and in other contexts as well. And we're actually now even using stimulation with focused ultrasound to reach even deeper parts of the brain. So it's not just one cap, but I think but the general question that you're asking, Martin, is exactly, to me, the right one, which is, how can we start to think about the practical utility of technologies like this? And I think there are already direct-to-consumer tools around things like transcranial direct current stimulation or transcranial alternating current stimulation, which is sort of another flavor of the same tool. Something else that we've also been looking at as a way to connect different networks to each other. But I think there is still there's a need for individualization. I think what will make these technologies more effective is a better approach to individualizing to a person's brain. Because what we find in the studies that we do with neuromodulation so far is that if you look at the group overall, you do see some effects. But these effects aren't consistent across the different people, across all different people. Some people are benefiting a great deal, some people not at all, right? And so I think one of the places we're really interested in going, and I think if this can be done well, then we'll start to see this transition toward more and more interest in people actually adopting a technology like this, is, can we identify markers within an individual person's brain that will tell us what kind of stimulation is going to be most effective for that person? And so if we can individuate it to you, then you'll start to see those effects more robustly. I also think
interesting.
Yeah.
Can you also just give a very concrete example? For example, let's take potentially this paper with a thinking cap, this funny title, and I don't know, can you explain it that way, that you say, okay, if we put on this cap, do this and that, this is going to be changed in the brain. That's the mechanism in the brain, and that's the value for you in, I don't know, this or that creative challenge moment or something. What's the value for the people? Because you were mentioning people that are benefiting a lot from that thing. Can you give a very concrete example and take us from, okay, that's what we do with the cap, that's happening in the brain, and that's the benefit of it?
So there are a lot of different pieces to the story. So one of the pieces to that story is, are we able to identify within an individual's brain where this particular mechanism that we want to target is playing out, right? So in that study, we didn't first get neuroimaging to target specifically each individual person's brain, but in the studies that we're doing now, that's exactly the approach that we're taking. But the other part of the question is, what are the other clues? What are the other clues within a person's brain that we should be able to detect that will tell us that this kind of stimulation or that kind of stimulation is likely to be effective? So we have some suspicions that we're looking at now. So things such as the ways that these different networks actually talk to each other at rest, right? Are they talking to each other a lot or a little bit at rest? We're starting to see some evidence that when different networks actually are talking less to each other at rest, the person is likely to benefit more from neuromodulation that enhances the connections between these networks, right? Okay. And that would be an individual difference that you wouldn't know by looking at someone. So you would need to get some sort of brain-based profiling in order to identify, the targeting in terms of the kind of stimulation, but also the location of stimulation. So those are some of the ways that we can individualize it. But to your question about what would it actually mean? I mean, the research that we did with the Thinking Cap, Thinking Zap that enhanced analogical reasoning. This is a kind of thinking that has been tied to innovation in science, but also in industry for hundreds of years. The idea that, okay, I can take some example from the past, whether it's taking an example from the solar system and developing the model of an atom, right? Or whether I'm, Henry Ford developed, the industrial, assembly line based on an analogy from the way that butchering factories actually were put together. These are just some of the more well-known. There are literally just books that will list,
basically
hundreds of these. So.
Taking a concept from somewhere and apply it in a different context, right?
That's right.
If I try to boil it down, right?
That's right. No, that's really right. And then sometimes putting different concepts together that weren't connected previously. So I think the value...
This was improved by applying this cap.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
But not for everybody, but because that's what you were mentioning, right? So it depends on your personal brain.
Yeah, it depends on your personal brain. That's right. The other thing that it depends on, which we thought was really interesting, is the stimulation was more effective when we cued people to try to think creatively. And that was actually in line with something that we predicted, because the way that technology works, the way that brain zapping works, the TDCS, is it's helping neurons get close to their firing threshold, making them actually fire. But it's not forcing them to fire. It's just getting them closer. So what that means is it's going to work best when you're trying to call on a brain region. This will help you do that, but it won't sort of force activity out of the brain. Okay. And I think that's really, in my mind, really quite nice, because it's a nexus of intentionality and sort of exogenous stimulation.
Yeah. When you think of really applying that to everyday life, everyday work life, is there also some other things that you could think of that might have the same effect? Probably not as effective as you stimulated it with the cap, but I don't know. I'm just thinking of could music help? Yeah, people listen to music, and does this also evoke some kind of effect like this, or is there any other things that people could do? I don't know, different colors that have the same effect. I don't know. Just thinking out very wildly. Yeah.
So I'll say one thing that's very optimistic and one thing that's very boring. One is so the answer to your question is a big and broad yes. Right. So many things can work and do work. And what seems to matter the most is that you enter a creative mindset. So one of the things that my lab has been very interested in is the idea that creativity is not just a trait that is stable and static and doesn't change. It's the way that sort of intelligence research has treated intelligence. It may be a trait. In fact, it probably is a trait, but it's also a state. Right. Mm-hmm. So what matters, I think, to those of us that want to enhance creativity is what are these state dynamics? And I think one of the very hopeful things related to Martin's question is that many approaches to training creativity, to fostering creative thinking in the moment or even across, longer periods of time seem to work. And I think what's really going on there is that there are many roads that lead essentially to the same place. The same place being, I'm now in a creative mindset. And whatever it takes that to get you there is valid, right? And can work. And so I don't think there's just one way to do that. So here comes the boring part. The boring part is what we have found is that the most reliable way to get people into a creative mindset is to simply say, please try to think creatively, which is always, it's too direct. It's not cute. It's not colorful enough, but we look at the effect sizes relative to colors, and colors have certainly been tried. Relative to music has been tried. Warm coffee versus cold coffee. All of these things, they can help. But the biggest single effect size seems to be this sort of very explicit cue that we've found so far.
But if it's that easy?
Well, but here's the thing. So it's that easy in the moment. But what I think matters is if music or colors or things that you actually want to do that are appealing to you are things you are likely to repeat more often. And I think that's very important, because one of the other things that we've seen is that getting into a creative mindset more often will allow you to gradually improve your creative ability. So it may be that in the moment, just sort of some researcher saying, please think creatively, will boost, your creative performance. But over time in your real life, you can't really replicate that. So the only way, or perhaps the best way for a person who enjoys music to enter that creative mindset is to go into doing creative things when they're listening to music, and then repeat that. And the more that you practice that, creative practice certainly leads over time to better creative performance.
Interesting. There's a second, let's call it, field of creativity research that you stepped in, which is about semantics, about memory, semantic distance. What is it about? What does this help us to understand creativity better, how creativity unfolds? And is there also something that we can learn from that, how we can approach things more creatively?
Yes, and actually, but do you guys mind? Can I add one more thing to the thoughts on how we can help people think more creatively? Because I think there's a couple of things that neuroscience is really good at. One is prediction of future behavior. Right, that's one thing that neuroscience can help you do, and the other is helping us understand how to intervene at the neural level. So one of the things I really wanted to talk about with how do we help brains think more creatively is on the side of education, right? So one of the directions that we're actually going now is to look at introducing creativity explicitly into science curricula and get neural measures of which ways of teaching essentially are leading to changes in neural markers of creativity. One of the reasons that is potentially valuable is because if we see that those neural markers then predict future creativity, right, then what we can do is potentially help to evaluate creativity in school curricula based on neural markers, right? So if those neural markers offer predictiveness of future performance that you couldn't get just by the externally observable, tests that students take and things like that, then neuroscience has made an actual contribution that you couldn't have had otherwise. But the another piece of it that we didn't talk about, so we talked about the neuromodulation in terms of the brain zapping, which is a lot of fun. We love to zap brains around here. It's a lot of what we do. But the actual ability to see your own brain activity, or to see some representation of your own brain activity, and essentially learn to stay in a creative state with neurofeedback. This is another direction that we're moving within the lab, and that other labs certainly are also engaging. And this is a clue about yourself that you yourself can use. You can to stay in that creative state. So I just wanted to add those other elements of how why the brain matters. Why does the brain actually matter in this story about how can we ultimately help people think more creatively? But I didn't want to take us away from the semantic distance.
No, that's super fascinating. I mean, I would like to really fly over to your lab and spend a week and see and learn even more.
Well, you're invited.
Yeah, thank you. I think we got to do that.
We'll make you a root beer float. We'll make you a root beer float when you come. So,
another good reason to come over. Okay, sorry. Back to your question, I guess, Martin.
Back in time when we've been at the university talking to students and so on, talking about their creativity, and I can remember myself in that situation as well, when I was asking them, do you think yourself or of yourself as a creative person? Most of these people answered, actually not. I am not one of these creative guys. And if we can change in the curriculum in a way that it supports people to actually be proud of their creative thinking abilities, and that they are aware of that everyone can be creative, that could be something that would be most helpful, I guess, in the same direction that you just explained. I can still remember that.
Yeah, I really think so. And you guys might have seen some of this work. I had a terrific graduate student who essentially founded a new subfield within creativity on creativity anxiety, which is exactly what Martin is describing here, which is this feeling of, even among very smart people, that I don't want to, or I get very anxious about having to generate new ideas, come up with something new. And we found that this applied across all different areas, not just in the arts, but really in the sciences and mathematics. We found that, this creativity anxiety was distinct from just general anxiety as a trait, but specific to thinking creatively. And it's been fascinating because we've seen that this creativity anxiety really seems to affect real world decisions that people make. What will I major in college? What career will I pursue? And if I think that career involves a lot of creativity, I will go a different direction, right? And what's really been fascinating is to see that when we actually assess people's creativity, people who are high in creativity anxiety often are much more creative than they think they are. And sometimes people who are low in creativity anxiety aren't quite as creative as they think they are. So it's not always an accurate reflection of your underlying ability. And so if we can adjust, as you're suggesting, Martin, if we can help schools understand this and help schools develop tools, and there are good tools for helping people, reconceptualize or cognitively reappraise what creativity is and make it less scary. This has been done a lot with math and people's anxiety toward math. We also know, since my grad student Rich Dacre, developed this line of work, a number of people have looked at potential interventions toward creativity anxiety and found that, actually evaluating other people's creativity is a great way to overcome your own creativity anxiety, which I think is a fascinating thing. I mean, it doesn't have to be mean-spirited, right? But if people are sharing their creative products with each other and you say, hey, look, someone else is, they're not perfect either, and that's really actually quite helpful. And so this sort of progressive peer feedback, which is an approach that actually developed out of the work of Vygotsky, who's a seminal developmental psychologist. Some of this approach seems to be effective. So in other words, there are things schools can do. And these are strategies that actually we know work in a number of contexts. And so, we're not coming up with them out of thin air. And I think it would be really exciting if schools started applying more of this toward creativity and specifically creativity anxiety.
Yeah, and take some of the geniusness out of it. I also remember myself to be a PhD student, looking at all these fancy, crazy papers, that are finally been published there. They all look so great, but once you dive deeper in it, you understand that until the moment it is being published, there have been so many moments where people are really stumbling upon it. Should I write it like this and like that? And I have been receiving this and that feedback, and you have the feeling that it was all a shitty piece in the very beginning, but you don't see it at the very end if you just look at the result, at the paper being published. And and to talk to these people about their processes that they went through might also be something that might be very helpful. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And again, as the editor of a journal, you see there's an expression in English. You see how the sausage is made, and it's ugly. But then the other piece, of course, is like when other people see your papers, they think, oh, this, I could never do that. This is too brilliant and too complex, right? So the same experience that you have when you see theirs, they have that experience when they see your papers. So yeah.
And regarding the anxiety topic that you said, I've just recently listened to an interesting podcast episode. I don't know where it was, but there was a novelist talking about their blockings, the anxiety. I think it is called the writer's block. There's something like this. And what she experienced is that whenever she starts to write, and she has to write a lot of things because at the end of the day, she has to produce, 1,000 words or something like that. So that at the end of, the month or so, she has something produced that she can hand in. But there's a real pressure of producing something that is creative. And the thing, what she does is, at the beginning of the day, where she feels the pressure of producing something, she turns the color of the text into white. So it's white on white background, actually. And so she doesn't mind. She is not looking at a real text being produced, but she's just typing in something, and creating something over time turns into gold or some interesting messages, some good story in the very end, and only afterwards she's looking at the text, turning the color around, and see what is it that I can make sense of that. But getting into a productive and creative production mode is something I think that keeps many people away from being creative, because they are just used to find the one correct answer, the one best answer. And how can you find that?
The correct first step. That's what we see in businesses. They're looking for the correct first step, and there's never the first. It's never going to be correct or the best. Just that's right. One first step. That's right.
Yes, and that sort of idea of psychological safety, which has been actually, some of the work related to creativity anxiety has also shown that establishing sort of a context of psychological safety is really important for helping people overcome this kind of anxiety. Yeah. But awesome. to your story about the writer and the white text, I think it's just one of the many fascinating stories, and you hear so many of these. There's so many roads that lead, I think, essentially to this same place, this be creative mindset, and whatever gets you there is probably the right path. Yeah.
Shall we go back to the semantic distance?
Yes, I
theory
took us some
or
distance
idea
away from the semantic distance, but now let's traverse that distance.
Yes, it's very distant, actually.
Walk the talk, or what's
there? You go. Yeah.
What is this about?
Yeah. So.
And where does this come from? Actually, is it something that is has been produced in the field of creativity, or is it coming from somewhere else? Was this also some kind of analogy that
this
you took from somewhere else?
In some sense? Yes. So when I was a postdoc, I was, you go to these talks and you follow, you look at papers. You think they have nothing to do with your own research, but at that time in the field of computer science, there were some large language models that were starting to be developed, nothing like what we have today. But the notion that these large language models put different concepts in different places within a semantic space. The notion that words that are used together, for example, so if I say, leaf and tree, those are going to be very close to each other. But if I say, leaf and shark, right? Those are probably pretty far apart, right? In terms of one, leaf and tree are used a lot together. Leaf and shark are not used very often. So when you position them within a semantic space, that is reflected by how close together they are or how far apart they are. And what started, it started to click a little bit was maybe we could use this in creativity as a quantitative proxy for the ability to connect ideas that are far apart, right? Ideas that don't seem similar, a way of measuring how far apart they actually are. We could use these semantic spaces that were being built for these large language models to calculate semantic distance, right? How far apart are the concepts? So then we started to use this in our analogy research and in other semantic association research. So you might have an analogy that's not very interesting, something like knee pad is to knee as helmet is to head, right? It's a perfectly good analogy, but you're not connecting things that are far apart in semantic space. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you say something like helmet is to head as ozone is to earth, right? Now you've made a connection across greater semantic distance. So this is the kind of analogy, that I think leads to innovations in science and in industry, as we discussed before. And so it became very useful to look at semantic distance as a way to quantify that, and also to make certain predictions in the brain about parametric changes in brain activity that would otherwise have been difficult to tie to something quantitative. So that was the beginning of the story. Obviously, now we're using much more advanced large language models with much more advanced semantic spaces that take context into account in much more sophisticated ways. But that's the same basic idea. And one of the things that's really interesting about it to me is the ability to use those kinds of metrics as feedback to help people become more creative, help people even see their own ideas as they develop. And I know you and I have had some previous discussions around other tricks that we can do with semantic spaces to look at thoughts, to visualize those thoughts as they develop, and use that as feedback to help people and help teams work more creatively, come to more creative ideas. So, I think that semantic distance and related measures of using the geometry of semantic space is still quite promising. Yeah.
Then I also think of, many of the creativity techniques, so-called techniques that people use are related to this probably, yeah, like the so-called buzzword technique, something like that, where you have a random buzzword that you set yourself and you think of what it does. The problem has to do with, the random word like a curry sausage, a currywurst, or any other random word, basically, to break out of your thinking patterns, to go somewhere else and then come back again and see if that might be helpful in any way. But is there also something that, if you're talking about making that more visible, more explainable, how people think, is that something that you think that people can take into their everyday lives, that they can probably also practice in that particular behavior that makes them better over time? There is this alternative uses test or task, something like that, where you think of what else could I do beyond the typical usage of, like, I don't know, any random object, like a spoon, for example, something like that, yeah. And here you also try to go as far as possible away from the typical use. Does that really work if you do that over time to help increase your creativity over time? Is it that it might be useful for something like that?
I think that's a very good question. I think the question of long-term creative practice, we see in the lab, we see relatively short-term effects, right? So we do have evidence that creative practice works, but we don't really have good studies on which kinds of creative practice work over and especially over longer durations, right? Mm-hmm. So if we do something over 3 days, it tends to work better than if we did it over 1 day in the lab. But you go beyond 3 days in the lab, it becomes an increasingly difficult study. And so this is one of the challenges, and something where I do think there's a lot of opportunity for academics to interact with people on the industry side, because I think if we are bringing people, if we have the context of people who are working at their jobs in a sort of daily way, engaging in some sort of creative practice, and then ultimately looking at how that's affecting their performance, that's the sort of thing that's difficult to replicate in a laboratory. But of course, if you have people coming to work every day, that's where they're going anyway. So it's, and if their job is intrinsically involving some creativity, those are the sorts of things that I think need to be answered more effectively. And there's, I think there's sometimes is a need for more rigor. To be frank, as the editor of a journal, that in terms of the papers that come in, more rigor in terms of the way that more scientific rigor in terms of the way that studies like that are conducted. But I think it is quite possible, and some of our work, where we do a little bit of work with people on the industry side. We do a lot more work with people in schools, and schools are just as messy as offices. In fact, maybe even messier. And we have found, ways of over time, and working with teachers, working with administrators, strategies that do allow us to do longitudinal work in real world settings related to school curricula. And so I think this sort of work, whether it's in schools, whether it's in industry, that's something I would like to see more of. I would like to see more good, meaningful, rigorous connections between academics and people in real world spaces, whatever those may be, because exactly the question you're asking, Martin, is a question that we need to answer, but we haven't done a good job answering it yet. Mm.
Is there something that you as a person very personally do? You're a super creative guy. Yeah, you produce very creative things on a daily basis. Yeah, is there something that you do in your very day-to-day life to train you, to practice your creativity, to foster your creativity in some situations? Are there things that you do on an everyday way?
I do my own. I do. I'm not a very good writer, but I like to write, and I think, taking time for that creative practice is helpful for me. and it helps. I feel more creative after I do it. Maybe I should scan my own brain and see if I'm actually showing changes in some of these neural markers. I feel more creative. I can honestly say, for as cliche as it is, just spending time with my young children is like wonderfully refreshing in terms of creative practice. I get to think thoughts that they're thinking, and that is I think an effective way to trick your brain into being less stuck on whatever you were stuck on.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Fascinating world. Wow. My brain is spinning right now. One thing that I still have in mind as a question to you, Adam, actually, and that's potentially coming from a very different angle right now, or coming back to the initial discussion we had in the beginning of our podcast here, is can you give a little bit more of an insight about those kind of networks in the brain? Because you referred on that, like the default mode network, for example, but we didn't really give a little bit of an explanation to the listeners out there. What is it actually? And potentially that is a nice coming back to the beginning of the podcast, because looking at the time, we don't have so much time left. But can you explain that a little bit more? What is it? What different networks are there? What's the role of those different networks regarding creativity? Potentially there's kind of a connection or a task they take over. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah. So with the default mode network, there is still a lot that's unknown, a lot that we need to answer about exactly what's happening in the default mode network. The most consistent thing we know about the default mode network is that the more demanding a task is in general, the less active the default mode network seems to be. Now, there have been a number of ways of explaining this. One way that people have explained this, which I think is at least somewhat valid, is that the default mode network is very involved, the default mode network decreases when you have externally directed attention. That when other networks in the brain that are important for doing some task that you have to pay a lot of attention to, that's, if you're sort of solving a puzzle, or if you're driving in traffic, and you have to pay a lot of attention so that, because anything could happen. It's a very complex scenario. These sorts of things. If you're doing a very difficult problem that somebody's put out in front of you on a screen when you're lying in an MRI scanner, which is how we tend to look at this, or if there's just something very visually complex that you have to try to figure out in the scanner, you see decreased activity in the default mode. Now, by contrast, there is some pretty good evidence that when you direct your attention internally, when you're thinking about your own thoughts, right? That's where we start to see less decrease in default mode activity. I don't want to say increase in default mode activity, because it's actually very hard to see the default mode increase above its baseline. Sometimes you can get that, but it's not very common. But in general, the more that you're focusing your attention internally on your own mental representations, the greater the default mode activity that you'll see. So especially in terms of less decrease in that activity. So if you consider this at least a marker of internal attention, internally focused attention, then I think that becomes part of the story of creativity, because creativity often involves taking the things that are already in my head, right, and identifying which of them might be a good fit for this, this moment, whether it's a good idea for a new piece of art, whether it's a good solution to a problem that's in front of me, but these multiple ideas, these internal representations. And then I think you have this other network that we've talked a lot about in prefrontal cortex, which also is sort of highly connected to parietal cortex. So sometimes it's considered frontoparietal network. But this network, to oversimplify it just a bit, is involved more with this kind of top-down cognition. So, okay, now I'm gonna identify what's actually a good idea, right? I'll be selective. I'll be a little bit more convergent in terms of identifying not just everything, but something good, right? And so this is a network that's involved with reasoning in general, and a lot of brain functions that sort of fall under the heading of intelligence seem to rely heavily on the frontoparietal network, including working memory, which is trying to keep certain information at the front of your mind while you're doing other complex tasks. So that's the story of those two networks. Yeah,
and it's called network because it's a combination of different regions in your brain that are active.
That's right.
Is that the reason why it's called network?
That's exactly right. Yeah, thank you. That's a good question because it's almost anything that the brain doesn't happen in just one place, and so in general, I think it's useful to think in terms of networks when we think about the brain. That said, the term network can be used sort of loosely, and so when we talk about the default mode network, for example, different researchers actually have quite different opinions about which actual regions of the brain should be included in the default mode network or not. They all tend to be toward the middle of the brain, but there are many mysteries still about the default mode network, and also specifically about how it could drive the kind of ideation that we see, or whether, in fact, it's just a marker of this ideation, even if the ideation is not happening directly within the default mode network.
Yeah, and is there also a connection between those kind of networks and what's happening in the brain to that moment of insight where we kind of, I don't know, typical thing, you're under the shower and you have a moment of insight, there's an idea popping up in your brain and you're not able to explain where it really comes from because you were not super actively thinking about it? Can you make a connection here for us?
Yes. So this is a great question. The one thing I will say is that the neuroscience of creativity is better at asking questions about creativity that happens on purpose than creativity that happens by accident. And both are very real. Both are very, very real. But if it's unpredictable and if it happens by accident, it is very hard to study it in a lab because you could bring somebody in for an hour and it might never happen at all. And even if it did, you wouldn't have known the timing of it. So it would be very hard to use neuroimaging to identify when it was and what brain activity was specifically associated with it. So that's a little bit of a caveat, which is important to keep in mind. But there is evidence for insight, at least when you're trying to have insight. Right. So it's sort of a halfway answer to your question. So particularly, Mark Beeman's lab has done a lot of this research looking at insight problem solving. So if you see, three different words and you're trying to figure out, well, what's the connection between those words? That's one of the classic creativity tasks. Sometimes people will think through lots of possibilities for what could connect them. Sometimes people feel like, oh, the solution just came to me. It just popped into my head. I could see that's got to be the answer, even though I don't remember sort of a stepwise procedure to get to that answer, right? It just showed up. It just popped up. When that sort of insight phenomenon happens, Mark and his lab has identified certain indicators in the temporal lobe of the brain, actually, that seem to be precursors for this kind of insight. And the temporal lobe is an interesting place. All parts of the brain are interesting in their own way, but toward the anterior end of the temporal lobe, where you see a lot of this, there's a lot of these neural markers of insight. That is a place with a lot of semantic representation, a lot of these neural representations that may, in fact, be part of the ideation process that's happening in the default mode. Those representations don't live in the default mode network. And they also don't live in prefrontal cortex if you want to integrate them to make analogies. To the extent that they live anywhere, they probably live most in anterior temporal cortex and in parts of the parietal lobe. So it may be that what Mark and his team are picking up on has more to do with the activity of these internal representations at sort of a subconscious level that is sort of happening just before you reach that sort of insight. But the connection, the story about what exactly the default mode is doing in all of that, I think still has to be unpacked more than it has been. But that's what keeps our jobs interesting, right? We still have these questions to answer. Yeah.
Yeah, but still, even if we don't know exactly what's going on, is there some advice that you can give to people if if this kind of network is so important to us, yeah, and we know our daily business lives, how they look like, back-to-back meetings, yeah, from morning to the evening. Even if we have some breaks in between, we take our smartphones, yeah, and get distracted very easily. Is there some advice that you can give to the people looking at how jobs look like today, probably in the future? Is there something that people can do to make use of that network more often, or more easily, or I don't know? Yeah.
Yeah, I think my answer comes back to this notion that there are so many roads to get into a be creative mindset. But whatever it is that gets you into that mindset, I think you want to lean toward that. I think you want to do that more often. And, there are some strategies that people have found useful, things like sort of allowing yourself to mind wander, allowing yourself to daydream, but doing it in sort of somewhat constrained context. So sort of directed daydreaming, or I'm not going to focus too much, but I'm also not going to just allow myself to completely go anywhere, right? So if you can sort of develop that happy medium between daydreaming or mind wandering and keeping the problem in mind, that's an effective strategy, at least for some people. But I really do think that it is sort of an individual thing. I think that there are different ways to reach that be creative mindset. And what works for you may be different from what works for me. But I think it's important to lean toward it, right? And to do it more, not less. And the more that you do it, the better you'll get at it. And yes, there are a number of mysteries to the neuroscience of creativity that we have yet to unpack. But I think there's an interesting point to be made there, which brings us back to some of the other stuff we talked about, which is there are a lot of mysteries about a lot of things in the brain that we still have to work on, but it doesn't keep us from using neuroscience in effective ways. So, for example, in pharmacology, right, in understanding the chemicals and in neurotransmitters and how neurotransmitter systems relate to different kinds of disorders, for example. There are many, many mysteries still to unpack, but it turns out you don't have to understand everything in order to develop treatments and interventions that are effective. You just need to identify the right targets and understand how to reach them, right? And so, I think a very similar thing is happening in the neuroscience of creativity. I think even if in the next 10 years we don't have a complete explanation for how all of these mechanisms are doing what they're doing, if we can identify which mechanisms are most important and how to influence the activity of those mechanisms, then that more complete explanation isn't even as important, because we reach that sort of applicability stage, that observation to intervention stage.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we don't have so much time left. I think we could go on for hours. It's a super interesting topic, and I think, as you said, a lot of things still to be unpacked in research field. But for us, at least, not being part of this research in depth like you are, still a lot of things to learn. But coming roughly to an end of this episode of our podcast, I don't know if there's any important question left from your end, Martin. Otherwise, I would ask the typical final question. To you, Adam, what's one thing you would like to tell to the people around here, the listeners out there, about creativity and neuroscience? Like the core thing, if you have to boil it down to, I don't know, 1 or 2 or 3 sentences. And also, I typically have this picture in mind. I don't know, potentially in Georgetown, or I'm thinking about New York City, a big billboard advertisement, and you have the chance to put something out there regarding creativity. To tell the world about creativity, and it's there for a year potentially. What would you write on that billboard? What's the message?
Please think creatively. That's what I would. That's what I would write. Yeah. Because putting people into that creative mindset does seem to be the most effective thing, even if it's boring. And so I think maybe that's the other part of the answer to Martin's question. It's okay if what gets you into the creative mindset is boring to other people. It's also okay if it's wildly interesting. If you like to dance naked on your roof and that's what gets you into a creative mind. I mean, the police may get involved at that point, right? That may be more. That's good. Yeah, that's the weekend plan, right? So, but if I could put one thing on a billboard, it would just say, please think creatively, so that people would go into the world doing more creative things. And a number of the things that we're now working on in the lab relate to assessing, relate to intervention based on observation, but they also relate to new computational metrics for creativity. And the reason for this is because we want to put creativity into high stakes assessment like when you get into college, assessment like when you get a job or you get promoted. And the reason that will matter now, perhaps more than it ever has, is it's going to be easier and easier to allow AI to do your thinking for you. And if you do that, then this capacity to sort of develop creative practice, to become more creative, your creativity will deteriorate. It will absolutely deteriorate. And I am worried for the world about this, but I'm optimistic that if people focus on staying in a be creative mindset, developing their own creativity, their own creative practice, that we can be creative and actually use AI to help us be creative instead of becoming lazy about it. But putting creativity into high stakes assessment, I think will force that, because if you can't get into college without your own creativity, if you can't get the new job without your own creativity, then it means you have to think creatively. Yeah. And so I think to some extent, the more creativity can be introduced into high stakes assessment, the more institutions will benefit by identifying creative people, and the more people will benefit because they won't allow themselves to get lazy and not think creatively.
Awesome.
Well, yeah, great final statement, and I think so much more to come. We definitely gonna stay in touch, Adam, and at some point, potentially next year, we're gonna plan to come over to visit your lab and see what are the new topics, the new breakthrough thoughts and findings on your end. So I think, I'm really curious to see what's coming in the future. Thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely, and bring some. Yes, exactly. Bring some German root beer so that we can test it out with ice cream over here. I would say bring the ice cream, but I don't think it'll make it on the plane. So,
it's a tough challenge.
Yeah,
but for that we also need to be creative.
Exactly.
All right.
Well, thank you
very
guys.
much, Adam.
It's wonderful.
Wonderful session. Yeah, and bye-bye, people out there.